Let us go to the first puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Checks in puzzle position are. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to c6, check. Rook to g1, check. The best move in puzzle position is Queen to c6, check. King to h3. Rook to e5. Another puzzle. The threats are pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. King to f4. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. g5. Rook to e3. Knight takes pawn. Another puzzle. Here are the threats. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to g6, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to h7, check. Queen to h8, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to c8. Rook to d6. Queen takes pawn, check. King to h7. Rook to f4. Rook to g6. Rook to h4, check. King to g7. Queen to e5, check. Another one. The threats are rook takes bishop, check. Bishop takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight, check. Queen takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are rook takes bishop, check. Queen takes knight, check. The puzzle is solved using bishop to e5. Queen to d2. Queen to g3. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are bishop takes bishop. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop takes bishop. Queen takes bishop. Rook to f8. Queen to e4. Rook takes rook, check. King takes rook. Queen takes pawn. Next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. The checks are rook takes pawn, check. Rook to h6, check. Rook to f5, check. Knight to f4, check. g4, check. The answer is rook takes pawn. Knight to f2, check. King to h2. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The answer is king to g6. c3. f7. c2. Promotes to queen. Next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes knight. Here are checks in puzzle position. Bishop to b5, check. The answer is bishop to g5. Knight to e7. Knight to h4. Next, the threats are pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The answer is h4. Pawn takes pawn. Queen to a4. Rook to d8. Pawn takes queen. One more. The threats are rook takes rook. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook to d1, check. The puzzle is solved using rook takes rook. King takes rook. King to d6. b7. King takes pawn. b5. King to e6. Another puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes knight. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes knight. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is queen takes bishop. Pawn takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Rook to d8. c3. Queen to b5. Queen takes queen, check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is rook takes pawn, check. King to b8. Rook to b5. Rook to d6. Bishop takes pawn. Next, threats in puzzle position are. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to f6, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is Queen to f6, check. King to g8, e5. Rook to e8. Rook to f1. Bishop to b5. e6. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes queen, check. Rook takes queen. Rook takes rook, check. Next, threats in this position are. Rook takes rook. Here are the checks. h4, check. Rook to a3, check. Rook to g1, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes rook. Queen to f2. Rook to g1, check. King to h4. Rook to g4, check. Pawn takes rook. Promotes to queen. Queen to f4, check. King to d3. Another puzzle. Threats in this position are. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes rook. There are no checks in this position. The answer is. Rook takes rook. Queen takes rook. e6. f6. Queen takes pawn. Queen to c7. Knight to e5. Bishop takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Pawn takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. King to h8. Queen takes rook, check. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. g5. Pawn takes pawn. King to c4. King to d6. King to b5. Let's see the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Queen takes bishop, check. The checks are. Queen takes bishop, check. The puzzle is solved using. Queen to d5. Queen to a3. Promotes to queen. Bishop to d6, check. King to g1. Queen to c1, check. King to f2. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is. King to d3. Knight to c5, check. Rook takes knight. Rook takes rook. Bishop to d2. Queen to a4. Queen takes queen. Another puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes rook. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is. Rook takes rook. Bishop takes rook. Queen to h6, check. King to h8. Knight to f6. Queen to e7. Bishop takes pawn. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight. Here are the checks. Bishop takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using. Rook to d8. Queen to h5. Bishop takes pawn, check. King takes bishop. Queen to d5, check. Queen to f3. Queen takes rook. Next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are. Pawn takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight. Queen takes rook. Queen takes pawn. The checks are. Queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Pawn takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Rook to d6. Queen to a8, check. King to d7. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to d4, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Rook to e7. Knight takes pawn. Rook takes knight. Next, the threats are. Queen takes knight, check. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes knight, check. Knight takes rook. Checks in puzzle position are. Queen takes knight, check. Rook takes knight, check. Knight to c3, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Knight takes rook. c5. a2, check. King to a1. Knight takes knight, check. Next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Bishop takes rook. Queen takes rook. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to b8 check. Rook takes pawn check. The best move in puzzle position is queen takes rook. Queen takes rook. Bishop takes rook. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.